My thanks more broadly to the Counter Extremism Project and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for involving me in this excellent series of events. I also wanted to thank Khalilullah for his very interesting presentation earlier. That detail of the Taliban ISIL-K rivalry and mutual accusations is fascinating. And it's very important, I think, that we do delve into it and that, we get into the detail of exactly what's being said and what the propaganda is saying. And at the same time, of course, interpret it carefully for what it means and what we can rely on, what we can't. Of course, some would seek to build counter-terrorist cooperation with the Taliban upon that Taliban ISIL-K dynamic. And I will argue later as to why I don't think that that is a good idea. I just also wanted to mention unconfirmed reports of Sanaullah Ghaffari's death, which I should be interested to see what the monitoring team has to say about this. They have just submitted their latest report on ISIL and Al-Qaeda to the 1267 Committee of the Security Council in New York, and that will be published later this month. So it'll be very interesting to see whether they've covered that conflicting reporting on what has happened with the leader of ISIL-K, Sanaullah Ghaffari. It was also very interesting to hear Khalilullah's mention of the Al-Siddiq office. And I just want to encourage everybody to look at the monitoring team's recent published reports. And I'm thinking not so much the ones from the last year, but perhaps the ones from a year ago or 2 years ago, where the monitoring team has produced groundbreaking reporting about the ISIL global network of essentially regional offices, hubs and spokes that they created. And that will give you a context for the Al-Siddiq office of the Directorate of Global Directorate of Provinces in ISIL, and its role both in Afghanistan and in the wider region around Afghanistan, and how it interrelates with ISIL core and with other regional offices of ISIL. Hence, it feels like we've been on tour together. And as always, I want to just thank you for that very powerful presentation, which is it's a wonderful thing to be able to follow and comment on. It's really been wonderful to be involved in these events together. And the timing is great. Of course, this is very much about the recent Counter Extremism report, Counter Extremism Project and KAS report. But it is good timing because we've had so much recent monitoring team reporting, including their most recent report on Afghanistan, which is still only a few weeks old. And so I will draw on both in my remarks, but starting with the CEP-KAS report, I just want to stress how impressed I am by its comprehensive nature and its depth, and the way that it makes these key points about the security and terrorism risks inherent under Taliban rule, that these have not received the attention that they deserve. And I think that this is because of an accident of timing of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in 2021, when the jihadi terrorist threat is being successfully managed in non-conflict zones around the world. And at the same time, geostrategic rivalries have eclipsed counterterrorism as a priority for many United Nations member states. I think the report is a state-of-the-art account of pretty much everything that you need to know about Afghanistan and its impacts and potential impacts on the rest of the world. I think it's really good on the complexity of the Taliban movement, internal Afghan dynamics, which should reinforce caution where people try to make quick judgments about moderates and hardliners in the Taliban, or good and bad Taliban. And of course, again, it's very good on the dynamics in play between the different extremist groups in Afghanistan. And the report has good, detailed recommendations. And that's really important because the international community is genuinely at a crossroads trying to make sense of what's happening in Afghanistan. It's trying to deal with the humanitarian issues that present in Afghanistan, but also with the full range of other issues, including the human rights issues. And so it's wonderful to have a comprehensive report that has so much in the way of recommendations for policymakers to consider. I won't go into too much detail on the regional groups in Afghanistan. I think, or the terrorist groups in Afghanistan, I think those have been reasonably well covered in the previous presentations. But I do want to dig a little into some of the more important individual groups. So mentioning the Pakistani Taliban, which I think is crucial. The Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan as one of the Uzbek groups, Jamaat Ansarullah, the key Tajik group. You've got the Uyghur Turkestan group, sometimes referred to as ETIM or TIP. And this is where we get into the neighborhood issue that Hans sort of foreshadowed, that so much of what's happening in Afghanistan, it concerns us globally, but it also specifically concerns the neighborhood. And those groups that I mentioned, of course, they are targeted against neighboring countries. And those groups are generally aligned with the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda. Now, as we've said, ISIL-K is different. It's hostile to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda, but it is keen to recruit disaffected members from the Taliban and from all of these allied terrorist groups. And it's had great success in attracting especially former Pakistani Taliban, TTP members. And again, the report, I want to give the reporter credit for its explaining the complexity of the Taliban, TTP, ISIL-K dynamic. ISIL-K adopts a hardline ideological position, and it accuses the Taliban of betraying the jihad. And I think that accusation genuinely worries the Taliban. And they worry that they will lose defectors to ISIL-K because the ISIL-K message is simple. And the Taliban are trying to do something much more complicated because they're trying to govern a territory that they have taken over. And that makes it hard for them to make compromises or to take tough controlling or enforcing measures against these groups because of that fear that they will alienate people, that they will be, they'd be accused of being sellouts, and that people will rally to the simpler ISIL message. Now, going into this point about the regional offices, Al-Sadiq office is in Afghanistan, and it has been co-located with ISIL-K, with ISIL Khorasan. And they do appear to work alongside each other reasonably smoothly. I wondered at one point whether there might be tension between the local agenda and the regional agenda that the Al-Sadiq office wants ISIL-K to also to support. But that doesn't seem to have created operational tension as far as we can judge. And it hasn't, the change in Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover in 2021, doesn't seem to have changed that, doesn't seem to have caused ISIL Core, for example, to change its attitude to the importance of ISIL Khorasan and the Al-Sadiq office. And it has in fact increased its investment in ISIL-K over the past 2 years. And ISIL-K has grown and got stronger over the last 2 years. That's partly because of reckless prison releases by the Taliban when they took over. Some is increased recruitment, the fact that it has more money that it's been given by ISIL core also helps it to pay wages, and in Afghanistan that can help you to attract fighters because people are looking for jobs in order to feed their families. But in terms of the numbers, it is important to be a little careful. And there's been a recent interesting sort of spat between the monitoring team and the US government, with the US government saying the monitoring team's latest figures on ISIL numbers and on Al-Qaeda numbers are alarmist. Now, I think there's some quite strong evidence to push back against that. Not least the fact that the monitoring team's modus operandi, which is to consult member states, means that they're getting information from the United States, but also from other member states, and they're doing their best to triangulate those figures. You do end up with a very wide range and a wide margin for error, but the trend that they identify, I think, is what matters. And all member states have agreed and told the monitoring team that they think that the numbers of ISIL-K have significantly increased over the last 2 years. On revenue, ISIL core made $500,000 US of new money available to ISIL-K in late 2021, recognizing the new opportunity that might be opening up in Afghanistan. And it's been interesting to see that then increased recently, with further tranches being paid, in which the Al-Sadiq office has an equivalent hub in Somalia, which is called the Al-Qarar office. And that has been an important conduit for funds reaching ISIL in Afghanistan. A fascinating instance where the global network seems to have delivered some real world effect. And it concerned the Americans sufficiently that they mounted a special forces operation in Somalia this January, killing Bilal al-Sudani. And he was the key Al-Qarar office figure in channeling funding to the Al-Sadiq office and to ISIL Khorasan. And again, I think when you get the chance to read the forthcoming monitoring team report later this month, it will be very interesting to see what they say about the Al-Sudani operation and whether the Americans successfully neutralized that particular channel of funding for ISIL-K in Afghanistan. Now, where I'd like to finish this response is in the question I mentioned earlier about whether we can work with the Taliban on counterterrorism. And I want to stress that I'm not hawkish in the sense of advocating against engagement with the Taliban. I think engagement is inevitable. You know, an engagement does not have to be in any way synonymous with recognition or endorsement. And engagement, in fact, is necessary if you're going to exert pressure, if you're going to use the leverage that you have to try to make the Taliban behave better. But the complexity of the ISIL-K Taliban dynamic, which is very well outlined in the CEP-KAS report, means that the my enemy's enemy is my friend approach will not work in Afghan counterterrorism. The Taliban cannot be relied upon to assess ISIL-K accurately. The Taliban, after all, has repeatedly lied about the presence of foreign extremists in Afghanistan. It's still lying about the fact that Ayman al-Zawahiri was detected and killed in Kabul only a year ago. And its accounts of ISIL-K vary wildly and without explanation, but broadly they want sometimes to say it's not a threat, we're in charge. And at other times they want to say it is a threat, therefore we need more international assistance. So they won't be honest or accurate in their assessments. They won't share assessments that we can believe. They won't act responsibly and with due process in partnership against ISIL-K. And I want to underline the due process point here. As all counterterrorism professionals understand, in order not to be counterproductive, CT work has to be legally and ethically compliant with a due regard for human rights. But the Taliban are a human rights black hole. Can you imagine what a joint CT operation with the Taliban would look like? You would have no control, no assurance of the conduct of arrests, interrogations, or the accuracy or exploitation of leads. You would have no assurance that your partners were not pursuing a hidden agenda, no confidence even that those being targeted were not identified for reasons of personal or political malice. You might even find yourself working on a hostage release scenario where the Haqqani network had actually orchestrated the hostage taking in the first place. So I really want to emphasize the importance of caution here. I've been concerned at some of the, what I consider to be naive calls to embrace the Taliban as counter-terrorism partners. And my very last point then is about the neighbors, again, as Hans mentioned. Both in regard to ISIL-K and to bilateral dealings with the Taliban, I think we need to pursue a neighbors first policy. Interventions by various global powers in Afghanistan over almost 2 centuries have all failed. But for Iran, China, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, there is no option but to engage with the authorities on the other side of their Afghan border. These countries also understand Afghanistan well because of their intertwined histories and the presence of related communities on both sides of each border. They invest in bilateral relations, in trade, in border controls, in intelligence. They have leverage, the ability and willingness to hold the Taliban to account for behavior that undermines their interests and security, and to incentivize better behavior with practical rewards. It is the neighborhood that holds out the prospect of a better future for Afghanistan, a horizon of prosperity through economic integration. And as I said, this applies also in the field of counterterrorism. Most of the neighbors have counterterrorism concerns about Afghanistan, and especially about ISIL-K and its relationship with their ethnic cousins in Afghanistan and with their nationals. And it's not just about controlling ISIL-K, it's about the Taliban living up to the Doha Accords and creating the conditions for diffusing extremism inside Afghanistan. Also, as the monitoring team and the KAS CEP reports both emphasize, suppressing the drug trade. I won't get into that because Hans has already delivered his tour de force on that. Now, the neighbors, they are also concerned about the drug trade. And, in all of these matters, they will not be fooled by Taliban policies that do not genuinely make them feel more secure. And their achieving increased security and stability would be a good indicator of greater security for the rest of us in the wider international community. Now, of course, the neighbors need to concert their policies and have each other's backs, not to be played off against each other by the Taliban. Meetings that they have held since 2021 have shown some promise in this regard, but not been conclusive. Here I see an expanded role for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its regional anti-terror structure, which is headquartered in Tashkent. This forum brings together all of the key non-Western stakeholders in Afghanistan, including India. And my very last point is just to echo what Hans said about the importance of the 1267 and 1988 sanctions regimes and of the monitoring team in a range of matters relating to Afghanistan under the Taliban. And to say the Taliban are still very anxious to have the 1988 sanctions annulled, which they claim they think they were promised under the Doha Accords. But of course, it was not for the Americans to promise that. It's for the United Nations and the Security Council to determine if and how the 1988 sanctions regime should be modified. None of the neighbors will speak up as loud advocates for 1988 sanctions because they're not looking to alienate the Taliban, but they're all strengthened by the existence of 1988 sanctions. In any conversation between a neighboring country and the Taliban, if the Taliban are being unreasonable, the neighboring country can point to the Chapter 7 obligations that still apply under 1988 and say to the Taliban, you're the pariah, not us. So, you know, we don't have to go the extra mile if you're not willing to make a realistic compromise with us. And I think that is a very powerful tool. Certainly the sanctions regime needs to be adapted somewhat. It feels out of date. Some of the information particularly in the guidelines for the application of 1988 sanctions is out of date, still refers to Republic era institutions, for example. But that is what we need. We need a cautious, targeted updating of the sanctions against Taliban individuals and entities, and not cancellation as the Taliban demand. Thank you.